This is my analysis of the CNBC Republican candidate debate. This was really not a debate between the candidates, interestingly enough. It was a debate between the candidates and the journalists who are asking the questions. This debate epitomizes the flaw, the defect that I've pointed out in previous analysis of these debates. They're really not debates. They're really joint press conferences. And in this case, the real debate occurred between the candidates and the journalists. And there's a good reason for that. The journalists have a different philosophy. They were all Democrats and they believe in a welfare state. And therefore, were really at odds with the candidates who are mostly more inclined to apply capitalism, limited government, than at least the journalists. So, what happened? Well, I've said before that one of the big defects of these debates is that there's a conflict of interest because the journalists want to create excitement, drama to increase ratings. They have really no interest in giving the debaters an opportunity to thrash out the reasoning that supports their differences in policies. So, what happens? Instead of having time to examine the reasoning on which the differences occur, it's mostly pitting one against another, and in this case, actual ad hominems by the journalists asking the questions. So, for example, the debate starts with John Harwood accusing Trump of having a caricature or some kind of comic book perspective on taxes. In other words, he used an ad hominem. Trump replied pretty tamely by saying that's not a very nice way to ask the question. What he really meant was he had just been insulted. So these journalists take it upon themselves to use ad hominem. Carl Quintanilla did the same thing with Rubio. He quoted a long slander about something that a paper in Florida, Sentinel, I think it was, said about Rubio, and Rubio knocked it out of the park by saying this is a total double standard, they're totally hypocritical. Other candidates did the same thing where they missed a lot of votes and this newspaper never came out against them. So the guy who really put it all together was Ted Cruz, and no wonder they call him a good debater, because he remembered all the ad hominems, all the attempts to pit one debater against another, and when he was asked a question, he used the Newt Gingrich strategy, which was proven years ago in a previous election debate. Attack these journalists for being unfair. And you should have seen the redness on Carl Quintanilla's face. That was worth the whole debate right there. He was flustered, taken aback, because his unfairness was pointed out. Using ad hominems and pitting one against another and slander just goes nowhere. And Carly Fiorina did the same thing when Becky Quick. All of these people are Democrats. They don't believe, they're not Republicans. Why do the Republicans accept a debate when all the people have a fundamental difference in philosophy and in party affiliation? And so whether it's John Harwood, who all he does is hack pieces against Republicans and create an angle against Republicans, or Carl Quintanilla, he's a little bit more moderate than Becky, and Jim Cramer, they're all Democrats. So no wonder there's a big divide between the journalists and the candidates. And guess who won? The candidates. They won that debate. The one between the candidates and the journalists. Now, I said before that this is not a real debate because it is a joint press conference and the journalists determine what questions are asked. And in a real debate, each debater decides what he thinks is important and he asks about that. That's the way it should be. But not in this debate. It was all about ad hominems, pitting one against another, trying to create controversy, drama to increase ratings, instead of giving the candidates an opportunity to examine each other's reasoning to see whose position was correct. So there was, as expected, an important divide between the establishment candidates like Kasich and the non-establishment candidates like Rand or Trump and Carson and Fiorina. What was the divide? Well, Rand thinks that we should not vote for an increase in the debt limit. But of course, Kasich thinks that's crazy. Of course we have to. So there's a real difference. Could they discuss the reasoning on which each supported their position? No. That's the problem with this defect. It doesn't focus on giving the candidates an opportunity to reason with each other, to ask each other questions, to determine who's right. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And the only way you can find out is by examining the reasoning that each person has to support their position. So similar things happen with the tax plan, where they accused the outsiders as having ridiculous tax plans that, well, of course it's ridiculous from the perspective of a Democrat, of a welfare statist person, of course. But it's not ridiculous if you take into consideration that if you really believe in reducing spending, which is the key issue, you can reduce taxes more. And if you know the fact that Art Laffer pointed out that when you reduce tax rates, often you get more revenue than less. So between those two things, you can have a 10% tax plan like Carson suggested. And it was interesting to me that he backed off from that. Now he's going to 15%. That doesn't look right, but nobody pointed that out. Anyway, you see a divide between the candidates, but this divide was not, we were not able to explore who was right, whether the journalists, in this case, or let's say between the establishment candidates who say this is fiction and fantasy world, to have 10% on all taxes, 10% tax rate, or 15% tax rate. Rand Paul, I think, wants 14-something% flat tax. Whether these things can actually work, balance the budget, and the country can live better if the government takes less of their people's money rather than more, which is what the Democrats want to do, which is what the journalists asking the questions want to do. Okay. So one other point that I've raised previously is that there's only one way you can figure out and really understand what a person believes, and that's understanding the principles that are guiding his actions. Now, the best way to know the principles that are guiding someone's actions is by listening to them state the principle. Nobody stated their principle. Listening to them state their principle, explain why the principle is correct, give examples, and then show by facts that they have been living according to that principle. When a person does that, you pretty well know what they're going to do in the future. So you know who to elect. And when there's a difference of opinion on which is the right principle, there should be a thorough debate, because that's the key issue. So, for example, there was a little bit of that in the debate, and with Carly Fiorina. She was explaining why a complicated system needs to be simplified, because the complicated system benefits the large corporations, the well-connected people, and the average citizen can't handle the complexity. Now, there's a principle there she was trying to explain it. She didn't state the principle, but she was trying to explain that principle, which is a good principle. We need to simplify the tax plan, and she wanted a 3-page tax plan, which is great compared to what we got now. Becky tried to destroy her reputation by saying that the guy that was in charge of the board, the chairman of the board, fired her. Carly Fiorina is a great debater, and boy, did she knock that right out of the park. Instead of proving that she wasn't qualified for president based on the things that she had done in Hewlett-Packard, she turned it all the way around and proved that she had the character traits that would make for a good president, because she could do what she did in Hewlett-Packard, she could do with the country. So that was just another example of Becky trying to destroy her reputation, and it totally backfired. So I gave this one to the candidates and the loss for the journalists. Thank you for watching, and please tell me what you think. Bye.